In order for a relatively small percentage of the population to have a lot of wealth, you've got to have a very large percentage of the population essentially acting as slaves. The people who control our biggest businesses and corporations to have a mass of poor people around the world that they can draw on for labor, that they can draw on to steal their resources, whether it's oil or diamonds or coltan or whatever the resources are. And as long as those people remain impoverished, as we call it, then they're at the mercy of those of us with wealth, and we get to exploit them. The fact of the matter is, we in the developed world have gotten richer and richer and richer and more prosperous and more powerful. They in the developing world have become poorer and poorer and poorer. Now, the deception here is that if you go into one of the major cities in almost any of these developing countries, you'll see incredible skyscrapers, beautiful buildings. It looks prosperous. What you don't see is that beneath all of that, there's a lot more poor people, and they're a lot poorer than they were before. So this whole idea of investing money in these countries and into the infrastructure and developing them hasn't worked from the standpoint of alleviating poverty or even reducing it. It's increased it. It has worked from the standpoint of making us richer. I think a basic question that we have to ask ourselves is who foments this system? And in fact, we do. We have the equivalent, and that is what I call the corporatocracy, which are very few, primarily men, who run our biggest corporations, and through them they control the United States government and every other one in the world, too, that they want to control. And in fact, at the highest levels, the people in the government and the people at the top of the big corporations are one and the same. They go through what we call the revolving door. So we began to be taught in business schools. It started in Iran when Mossadegh was elected democratically as president of Iran in the early 50s, and he began to nationalize oil companies, and we didn't like that. So we decided we had to get rid of him, and we sent in a CIA agent, Kermit Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt's grandson, and he was extremely successful at getting rid of this democratically elected president of Iran and replacing him with a terrible dictator, the Shah. But he did it very quietly. He did it with a few $1 million and without much violence and without the risk of war with the Soviet Union. And at that point, we feared nuclear war with the Soviet Union. And so this sent a really strong message. This works. This is the new way to build empire. Use economic hitman. Kermit Roosevelt was, in essence, the first economic hitman. He was also a jackal. He was the two combined. But he was a CIA agent, a card-carrying government employee. And so very quickly we realized that that's no good. But if he'd been caught, we would have looked pretty bad. So we developed a new class of people, which were like me. And we work for private companies, consulting firms, whatever. And we're economic hitmen. In essence, we work for the corporatocracy, the government, but we're not paid directly by them. We're paid by a consulting firm. Economic hitmen have many vehicles to make this happen, but perhaps the most common one is that we will identify a country, usually a developing country, that has resources we covet, our corporations covet, like oil. And then we arrange a huge loan to that country from the World Bank or one of its sister organizations. Now, most everybody in our country believes that loan is going to help poor people. It isn't. Most of the money never goes to the country. In fact, it goes to our own corporations. It goes to the Bechtels and the Halliburtons and the ones we all hear about, usually led by engineering firms, but a lot of other companies are brought in. And they make fortunes off building big infrastructure projects in that country. Power plants, industrial parks, ports, and those types of things. Things that don't benefit the poor people at all. They're not connected to the electrical grid. They don't get the jobs in the industrial parks because they're not educated enough. But they, as a class, are left holding a huge debt. The country goes deep into debt in order to make this happen. And a few of its wealthy people get very rich in the process. They own the big industries that do benefit from the ports and the highways and the industrial parks and the electricity. The country's left holding this huge debt that it can't possibly repay. So at some point, we economic hitmen go back in and we say, you can't pay your debts. You owe us a pound of flesh. You owe us a big favor. So sell your oil real cheap to our oil companies, or vote with us on the next critical United Nations vote, or send troops in support of ours to someplace in the world like Iraq. And so we use this whole process as, first of all, getting their money, basically, money we loan them, to enrich our own corporations, and then to use the debt to enslave them, to imprison them, to get them to have to agree to selling off their resources cheap. It's an amazing system, and in the process of doing that, we have, in essence, created this empire, and we've done it without the military, without most citizens knowing that it ever happened. In fact, most citizens believe we've done a great thing. We've given this country, we've put this country in a terrible, terrible situation, in a terrible predicament. A few of its wealthy people have made a lot of money, and they've invested in real estate in Florida or Swiss banks or stock markets overseas. They've taken their money out of the country, and they become very rich. And if something goes wrong in the country, they just leave. But the other people are left holding this huge debt, and as a result, they can't afford the education systems, the water and sewage systems that they need, the health care, and all the other civil amenities that they need. And of course, that in turn feeds the whole system, so we can go back in later and offer another loan to privatize their education system or to develop their sanitation system, and the process is repeated and repeated and repeated. And it just, when someone like me is sent into a country to justify a loan, for example, one to develop a power system, we develop these 20, 25-year economic forecasts that show that if we invest this money into the electric system, then the economy is going to take off. That's all it's needed. And we inflate these tremendously. Hugely inflated forecasts. And these are not realistic by any means, and the people making the forecasts know they're not realistic. Tremendous pressure is put upon us. Tremendous pressure was put upon me to make these forecasts higher and higher and higher to justify more and more loans. So the economic forecasts are developed to justify loans, not to present any picture of reality. And recently, there's been a lot of talk about debt forgiveness. 18 countries were singled out as ones that were in line to have their debt forgiven. But it turns out as this round of debt forgiveness that's been proposed is an incredible subterfuge. It's which one of these 18 countries then will have to agree to conditionalities that benefit the corporatocracy. Things like privatizing. That's a big one, that they have to privatize. And another one is that they will not be able to ship out products or raw materials that threaten ours, such as some agricultural goods, that they will have to accept restrictions on what they can sell to the United States and the G8 countries. And on the other hand, they will have to accept our restrictions. And so it's this very, very rigged system. And the world hears, oh, debt forgiveness. And celebrities go out and talk about debt forgiveness, and they're being exploited too. And we all say, oh, isn't it wonderful? We're being so generous. We're going to forgive all this debt. We've given all these countries all this money. Now we're going to tell them they don't have to pay it back. The fact of the matter is, we've asked for something much worse. They would be so much better off never to have had the debt, of course, or to just pay it off. As an example, let's take a country that has accumulated a lot of debt, and they owe the World Bank or one of these organizations money. And they come back and say, well, you know, we need a new water system in one of our cities. For example, Bolivia did this with Cochabamba. We need a new water system. And the IMF at this point steps in and says, well, you've got a lot of debt, and somehow we've got to restructure things. We've got to implement some policies that'll rationalize this process. And so, yes, Cochabamba needs a new water system or better management. So what you need to do is privatize it, because obviously the current system isn't working. And So the deal is struck that there may be some money invested into that system if privatization occurs. And the privatization is rigged. It's going to be one of our companies that's going to own it. In the case of Cochabamba, it was Bechtel, or a subsidiary of Bechtel. And they went in and developed the water system and restructured the whole thing in Cochabamba. And suddenly water became extremely expensive for the poor people. They couldn't afford it. And they rebelled against it. Don't like what a democratically elected leader of another country is doing, for example, opposing the exploitation of oil in his country, as Chavez is doing in Venezuela, or the exploitation of gas or water, as Morales is doing in Bolivia, then we try to corrupt people into changing that and going back to the old system. And we try to corrupt those particular officials. And once these presidents were elected, someone who looks like me, I had the job at one time, will walk into that president's office, and says, "Congratulations, Mr. President," or in the case of Chile, Ms. President. "And now I just want to remind you that I can make you and your family very, very rich if you play my game, our game. Or I can see to it that you're thrown out of office or assassinated if you decide to fulfill your campaign promises." And usually it's said a little more subtly than that because there may be a tape recorder listening. But they get the message because every one of those presidents knows what happened to Arbenz of Guatemala, and Allende of Chile, and Roldos of Ecuador, and Lumumba of the Congo, and Torrijos, and on. The list is very long of presidents that we have had thrown out or assassinated. There's no question about that. Doing the corrupting. We're doing the corrupting in most cases. And I talked about this on a presidential level, but it happens all the way down through the ranks. It happens at every governmental level, and it happens in the corporations in those countries, and it happens throughout the whole system. And under Mossadegh, we overthrew a leader, a democratically elected leader, because he wanted to get more of the oil profits from Iranian oil to go to the Iranian people. We did the same thing in Iraq under Qasem, who was a very popular president of Iraq, and decided that he wanted to get more of the profits from Iraqi oil to go to the Iraqi people, not to the foreign companies. So we decided he had to go. He had to be assassinated. We sent an assassination team in the early 60s. It was headed by a young man at the time who failed and got wounded in the process and had to flee the country. That was Saddam Hussein. He was our hired assassin. He failed, so the CIA went in directly and had Qasem publicly executed on Iraqi television and put Saddam's family in power. We've done this time after time after time. Usually the economic hitmen are successful, so we don't need to send in the jackals. But on those occasions when we're not successful, as for me, I failed with Omar Torrijos in Panama and Jaime Roldos in Ecuador. And so the jackals were sent in and assassinated these men. On the very few instances when neither the economic hitmen nor the jackals are successful, then and only then do we send in the military. And this is what happened in Iraq. The economic hitmen were unable to bring Saddam Hussein around. The jackals were unable to take him out. He had very loyal guards, and he had look-alike doubles, so it was difficult to take him out. And so we sent in the military.